She had 48 cents, a dead husband's name, and 3 minutes before the cold killed her. May Rowan stood in the middle of Frost Hollow's main street on the worst night of 1883, and the town did not blink. Snow drove sideways off the mountain like the sky itself had turned against her. Her dress was wrong for this weather. It was wrong for any weather, and the boots on her feet had a crack along the left sole that let the ice talk directly to her skin. She'd been thrown out of the Rusty Nail Saloon with less ceremony than a broken chair. A stranger was walking toward her through the storm. She didn't know yet that he would change everything. She didn't know much of anything in that moment, except that she was about to die, and that some stubborn, unreasonable part of her wasn't ready. If this story grabs you, hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Rusty Nail was not a good place. Nobody who spent time inside it would argue otherwise, but it was warm, and in Frost Hollow, in December of 1883, warmth was the only currency that really mattered. May had understood this the way you understand something that's been grinding against your ribs for months. She'd taken the maid's position there in late September, just before the first real cold came down off the peaks and sealed the mountain pass like a hand pressing a lid on a jar. The pay was thin, $2 a week and a cot in the storage room behind the kitchen. But it was shelter, and shelter was survival, and survival was the only goal May Rowan had permitted herself since the fever took her husband Daniel 14 months ago and left her with nothing but his name and a small wooden cross she carried in her coat pocket. She'd worked hard. That part she knew without question. She scrubbed floors on her hands and knees until the skin cracked at her knuckles. She hauled water from the well before dawn, even when the rope froze and she had to chip ice off the bucket with her bare fingers. She changed linens in the upstairs rooms where the saloon kept its other kind of business, and she didn't allow herself to think too carefully about what that work meant or what it said about the establishment that employed her. She kept her head down. She did the job. She told herself it was temporary. Then in November, the stovepipe in the kitchen caught fire, and the back wall of the Rusty Nail burned before Hank Cutter's men got the blaze under control. The storage room, May's storage room, was gutted. Her cot became ash. The small tin box she kept under it, with $11.30 inside, melted into something that wasn't money anymore. Hank Cutter charged her for the damage. $7, he said, standing behind his bar the morning after the fire, not even looking at her while he said it. He was polishing a glass that didn't need polishing. He had small eyes and a wide, flat face, and he'd built a comfortable life by making sure every transaction landed in his favor. Stovepipe had to be replaced. Back wall's gonna need a carpenter come spring. You were living in that room, the pipe was yours to maintain. May had stood there with soot still in her hair and said, "Hank, the pipe was never mine to maintain. I'm a maid." "You're a tenant," he said. $7. She didn't have $7. She had 11 cents. She worked through November without a room, sleeping on a bench in the saloon's back hallway, rolled in a horse blanket that smelled like something she tried not to identify. She told herself she would pay the debt down, dollar by dollar, and eventually Hank would forget the rest of it, or she'd have enough saved to settle it and leave Frost Hollow before the worst of winter locked the pass for good. But Hank Cutter did not forget things. That was how he'd built what he had. By the first week of December, with the debt somehow sitting at $11 after he'd added what he called accommodations fees for the hallway bench, May had started to understand that she was not going to work her way free of this. The math wasn't math anymore. It was a trap with teeth, and she'd walked in with her eyes open because the alternative had been standing in the cold. The night it ended, a Tuesday, there had been a piano player in the main room and a full crowd, and more whiskey flowing than the town's stomach could reasonably hold. May had been moving between tables with a rag and a tray, clearing glasses, keeping invisible the way good maids learn to do, existing in the room without existing in anyone's awareness. When Hank Cutter's hand came down on her shoulder and turned her around with enough force to slosh beer across the tray. $23, he said. She stared at him. What? Total. With this week's room and board, you're at $23. He said it plainly, no malice in his voice, like he was reading a figure off a ledger, which she supposed he was. You got it? The piano kept playing. Nobody nearby was paying attention, or if they were, they'd learned to look elsewhere. This was Frost Hollow, and people didn't interfere with what happened inside the Rusty Nail. Hank Cutter had spent years making sure of that. No, May said. You know I don't have it." "Then we have a problem." He took the tray out of her hands with that same mechanical efficiency and set it on the nearest table. "I run a business. I'm not a charity. I'm working, not hard enough." He looked at her the way a man looks at furniture he's decided to sell. "There are other ways to settle this. Women in your position, no." The word came out before she'd finished deciding to say it, sharp and flat, like a door slamming. "No." Something shifted in his expression. Not anger exactly, more like the mild irritation of a man who'd had a plan and was now adjusting it. He reached under the bar and came back with her coat, her thin, inadequate coat, and held it out to her. "Then you're done here," he said. "Get out of my place." "What?" The cold hit her like a physical blow. Not gradually, not with the slow creep she'd grown accustomed to in the drafty hallway. This was immediate and total, the kind of cold that made her understand, with the clarity that only genuine danger produces, that the human body is not designed for this. It wasn't built for -30-degree air. It wasn't built for wind that came off a mountain in December and found every gap in every garment like it was looking specifically for her. She stood on the boardwalk outside the Rusty Nail and looked at Frost Hollow's main street and tried to think. There were maybe 200 people in Frost Hollow. She'd been there 3 months and she couldn't name 5 of them who'd speak to her. Not because she was disliked exactly, but because she'd arrived already in a position that made social connection complicated. She was Hank Cutter's maid, which put her below the category of person that the town's residents considered worth cultivating. And she was a widow, which in 1883 in a frontier settlement meant she existed in a kind of social purgatory, too independent to be pitied cleanly, too vulnerable to be treated like an equal. She had 48 cents. She'd counted it that morning out of habit, the same way she counted it every morning, because keeping track of what little you had was one of the ways you reminded yourself that you hadn't quite hit bottom yet. 48 cents did not buy a room anywhere in Frost Hollow. The boarding house was $1 a night minimum, and Ethel Marsh, who ran it, had a policy about unaccompanied women that had less to do with propriety than with Hank Cutter, who had an arrangement with most of the town's commercial establishments. The church. She'd been in it once, her first week, when she still thought finding community might be possible, was locked at night. The livery stable would be warm, technically, but Amos Pruitt, who ran it, was a drunk with hands that didn't stay to himself, and May had learned that on her second day in town. She started walking. Not toward anything, just walking, because movement produced a fraction of warmth, and standing still was death. She pulled the coat tighter and pressed her arms against her sides and bent her head against the wind and put one foot in front of the other on the packed snow street, and she thought, and she hated herself for thinking it, but she thought it anyway, "I am going to die here. I am going to die in the street of a town I don't belong to, and by morning they'll have moved me somewhere out of sight because I'm an inconvenience." Daniel would have hated that. He'd had a stubborn streak about dignity, about the idea that people deserved to be seen and treated like they mattered. It was one of the things she'd loved about him, and also one of the things that had made their life together so hard, because Daniel Rowan had never learned the art of making himself smaller, and the world had eventually found a way to punish him for it. She thought about Daniel now the way she always did when things got bad. Not with grief exactly, not anymore, but with a kind of bone-tired conversation. "Well," she told him in her head, "it's bad. You'd probably tell me to keep walking. So that's what I'm doing." The snow was coming harder. She could feel her feet going strange, not painful anymore, which she knew was worse than pain. Her fingers had stopped cooperating with simple requests like hold the coat closed. She was on the north end of the street now, where the buildings thinned out and there was nothing between her and the mountain wind but 40 feet of open air and bad luck. Her legs buckled. She grabbed the corner post of the last building on the street, a disused assayer's office, dark and locked, and held on with both arms and tried to gather herself. Her breath was coming out in ragged clouds. She could hear her own heartbeat doing something irregular, a skip and stagger that she'd never felt before and didn't like. "Get up," she told herself. "You can sit down later. Get up." She couldn't quite get up. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps in the snow, heavy ones, the kind made by a man with size and weight behind him. And then a lantern's glow cutting through the blizzard, and then the man himself. He was enormous. That was the first thing, and there was no polite way to soften it. He was simply one of the largest human beings May had ever seen. well over 6 feet, with shoulders that had been built by years of actual physical labor rather than any ambition toward appearance. He wore a heavy wool coat that would have been a blanket on most men, and a hat pulled low, and he moved through the storm with the unhurried steadiness of someone who'd made peace with bad weather long ago. He stopped when he saw her. She was still holding the post, still half crouched, probably looking like exactly what she was, a woman in the process of dying in the street. She met his eyes because she couldn't think what else to do, and she waited for him to keep walking because in her experience, that was what people did. He didn't keep walking. He crouched down to her level, which, given his height, was a significant architectural undertaking, and held the lantern to the side so it wasn't blinding her and said, "How long have you been out here?" His voice was lower than she'd expected, not unkind. "I don't know," she said. Her words came out strange, a little slurred. She wasn't sure if that was the cold or just the general collapse of her ability to manage impressions. "Long enough." "Can you walk?" "I was walking. Before you were holding that post." She didn't have an answer for that. He straightened up and stood there for a moment, and she could see him thinking. She could actually see the calculation moving through his face, something being considered and decided. Then he said, "There's a diner 2 blocks back, still open. Come on." "I don't have money." "I didn't ask." She looked at him. He was looking at the street ahead, patient as something geological. He wasn't extending a hand or making a show of it. He was just waiting for her to decide. May Rowan had spent 14 months being very careful about accepting help from men she didn't know, and every instinct she'd developed in those 14 months was currently being overruled by the fact that she could no longer feel her left foot. She pushed off the post and stood up. The diner was warm and nearly empty. Just an old man sleeping over a coffee cup in the corner, and a woman behind the counter who looked at May's condition and didn't comment, which May appreciated more than she could say. The man, she didn't know his name yet, ordered 2 coffees and a plate of biscuits without asking what she wanted, which under normal circumstances would have annoyed her, but she was too busy trying to remember how to have a body temperature to care. He sat across from her at a small table near the stove and waited while she wrapped both hands around the coffee mug and let the warmth move into her palms and up her wrists. "Thank you," she said, when she trusted her voice to work properly. He nodded. He had a particular quality of stillness that she'd noticed outside. Not the stillness of someone bored or checked out, but the stillness of someone who'd learned that most situations resolved themselves faster if you waited before speaking. She looked at him in the proper light for the first time. Dark hair, cut practically short, a jaw that could have been carved from the same rock as the mountains outside, a scar above his left eyebrow, old and well-healed, the kind of mark left by something that went badly at some point and was now simply part of his face. His hands on the table were a logger's hands, not dirty, but permanently marked by the work, with calluses in the specific places that axes and saws produced them. "Gideon Ashcroft," he said. "May Rowan." He picked up his coffee. She waited for him to ask what she was doing out in that storm, or to offer some opinion about her situation, or to make some remark that would tell her what this was about. Men who helped strange women in blizzards generally had a reason, and the reason was rarely simple charity. He didn't say anything. He drank his coffee. She ate a biscuit. It was the best thing she'd tasted in weeks, which said more about the last few weeks than it did about the biscuit. After a while, he said, "You work at the Rusty Nail." "Worked," she said. Past tense. "Hank threw you out." She looked up. "You saw that?" "I was at the bar. Didn't feel the need to witness the rest of it." He set his mug down. "How much does he say you owe him?" She felt her jaw tighten. "That's not your business." "No," he agreed. "It's not." Another silence. The old man in the corner snored once and resettled. Outside, the wind hammered the diner's front window with a sound like thrown gravel. $23, she said. She didn't know why she said it. Maybe because the cold had dissolved some of her usual defenses. Maybe because she was tired of carrying things alone. And it wasn't $23 of real debt. He built it from nothing. First it was 7, then 11, and now it's 23, and I've worked 3 months to get it there. Gideon looked at her across the table. His expression was difficult to read. Not suspicious, not pitying. Thinking, maybe. "I have a proposition," he said. The word dropped into the warm air of the diner and sat there. May put her coffee down. "Go on," she said. Her voice was neutral. She'd learned how to make her voice neutral. "I have a claim up in the mountains, north of the pass, about 12 miles beyond the Harker Ridge. Logging operation. I cut timber, sell it to the mills in the spring thaw. I've been up there 4 years," he paused. "I need a wife." The silence that followed that sentence had a specific texture. "Excuse me?" she said. "Not—" He stopped, seemed to search for words, which cost him some visible effort. "It's a practical matter. Legal. The land claim requires a married occupant for the permanent deed. I've been on provisional status 4 years. If I'm not married by the time the assessor comes through in spring, I lose the claim to a lumber company that's been working to take it from me for 2 years. He looked at his hands on the table, then back at her. "I'm not asking for— It wouldn't be that kind of arrangement. You'd have your own space, your own decisions. I need a name on a document." May stared at him. "And in return," she said, "I pay your debt to Hank Cutter, tonight. And I provide shelter and food through winter and into spring." He met her eyes without flinching. "It's a business arrangement. You'd be free to leave when the pass opens in spring if that's what you want." She studied his face for signs of the thing she was looking for. The angle, the hidden prize, the tell that would explain what he was actually after. She'd gotten good at reading men in the past year. She'd had to. She couldn't find it, which could mean he was genuinely what he appeared to be, or could mean he was very good at not appearing to be what he was. "Why me?" she said. "There are women in this town who—" "None of them would go up the mountain," he said. "I asked. Not in winter." A pause. "You don't have anywhere else to go." It wasn't cruel the way he said it. It was just accurate. May looked at the window and the black storm pressing against it, and thought about the rusty nail, and the hallway bench, and Hank Cutter's flat eyes, and the way the cold had spoken to the bone in her left foot. She thought about Daniel, who would have told her to trust her instincts. She thought about what her instincts were actually saying, as opposed to what her fear was saying, because those were two different things, and she'd learned to tell them apart. Her instinct said, "This man sat with you and bought you coffee and told you the terms plainly and didn't touch you." Her fear said, "You don't know him." Her instinct said, "You also don't know what happens if you say no." She picked up her coffee mug and finished it, set it down. Looked at Gideon Ashcroft across the table. "If I say yes," she said, "I have conditions." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not quite relief, but something adjacent to it. "Name them." "You said my own space and my own decisions. I need that to mean something real, not just something you say tonight." "Understood. If I decide in spring that I want to leave, you don't make it hard." "I won't." "And you pay Hank tonight, in front of me. I watch him take the money and tell me the debt is settled." "That I can do," he said. He put both palms flat on the table and looked at her steadily. "Do you have any others?" May thought for a moment. The wind shook the diner window again. She could still feel the cold in her feet, the residue of it, the memory of what the street had been offering her 20 minutes ago. "No," she said. "That's all." Gideon Ashcroft nodded. He reached into his coat and counted bills onto the table, precise, unhurried. And then he stood up and buttoned his coat and said, "Let's go settle it then." Watching Hank Cutter take the money was one of the more complicated experiences of May's life. Gideon didn't make a scene of it. He walked into the Rusty Nail with May half a step behind him and found Hank at the bar and put $23 on the counter in front of him and said, without preamble, "May Rowan's debt, settled in full. I want to hear you say it." Hank looked at the money, looked at Gideon, looked at May. His expression went through several things quickly. Surprise, calculation, irritation, the careful neutrality of a man deciding how to respond to a situation he hadn't predicted. "Gideon Ashcroft," he said. "Hank." "Didn't know you two were acquainted." "Say it," Gideon said. Not loud, not threatening, exactly. Just the particular tone of a man who'd decided the conversation had a fixed endpoint and was waiting for Hank to get there. Hank Cutter looked at May one more time, and there was something in his eyes that she filed away. Not anger, not quite, but a recorded note, the kind of man who didn't forget when things didn't go his way. "Debt settled," he said. "Miss Rowan's square with the house. He took the money off the counter. "Good night, Hank," Gideon said, and turned and walked out without another word, and May followed him. On the boardwalk outside in the blizzard, she exhaled. "He's not happy," she said. "No," Gideon agreed. He was looking up the street at the direction of the livery stable. "Do you have belongings?" "Not many." A pause. "Most of what I had burned. We'll get what's left tonight. The road to the pass is better before dawn. Less wind off the eastern ridge." He glanced at her. "Can you ride?" "Tolerably." "Tolerably is enough," Sat. She retrieved what remained of her life from the hallway of the Rusty Nail in a bag she could carry in one hand. 2 dresses, a wool shawl that had seen better decades, Daniel's cross, a hairbrush with 3 missing tines, and a small book of poems she'd bought at a traveling market before she'd been poor enough to stop buying books. She stood in the hallway one last time and looked at the bench where she'd slept for 6 weeks and felt nothing clean. Not relief, not sadness, but the complicated muddle that sits between them when a bad thing ends without anything clearly better beginning. She walked out without looking back. She'd gotten good at that, too. Gideon was waiting in the street with 2 horses. His own, a big gray with a temperament that matched its owner, and a roan mare he said he'd borrowed from Amos Pruitt at the livery. He had a packed supply bag thrown across his saddle horn and had added to it, she noticed, what appeared to be an extra wool blanket. He helped her up onto the mare without making a production of it. Just cupped his hands for her boot, a practical gesture, nothing attached to it, and then swung up onto his own horse and pointed north and said, 12 miles. We'll be there before sunup." 12 miles in this storm? "Horses know the way better than we do," he said. "The Grays made this trip 40 times. May looked at the gray horse. The gray horse looked back at her with the calm disinterest of an animal that had decided humans were generally a manageable inconvenience. "All right," she said. They rode north, shouting. The journey took 4 hours. She would remember it later as a series of physical sensations more than anything else. The roan mare's steady warmth between her legs, the only reliable heat source in the world. The way the snow compressed under the horse's hooves with a sound like something small breaking. The mountain on their right, massive and dark, occasionally visible between curtains of blowing snow and then disappearing again. Gideon's lantern ahead of her, swinging at his saddle, a small, consistent fire in all that black and white. He didn't talk much on the ride. She'd expected that from him already. When he did speak, it was practical. "Hold left here, there's a drop on the right side of the trail, or this section's icy. Let her pick the pace." And she answered in kind, and gradually the silence between them settled into something that wasn't uncomfortable, which surprised her. She thought about what she'd done. She'd married a stranger. Well, not yet, technically. He'd said it would need to be made legal, and they'd see to that in the morning, apparently, at the settlement they were heading to, which had a man of some official function who could perform the ceremony. But she'd agreed to it, which felt like the operative step. She'd agreed to marry a man she'd known for 4 hours, based on the evidence of coffee bought without being asked and a debt paid without hesitation. She'd agreed to go up a mountain in a blizzard to live in a place she'd never seen. She'd agreed to all of this because the alternative was a post on Frost Hollow's main street and a body that had started making alarming announcements. Daniel, she thought, you would have thought this was insane. She could almost hear him. May, you don't even know if he's telling the truth about the land claim. May, you're riding into a mountain in December with a man the size of a barn. May, this is exactly the kind of situation you always told me I created by trusting the wrong people. Yes, she thought back, but you also always said that all the people you trusted wrong, you'd rather have trusted wrong than not trusted at all. You said that 2 weeks before you died, and I thought it was the fever talking, but I wrote it down anyway. The lantern ahead of her swung. The horses walked on. At the 3rd hour, the trees thickened on both sides of the trail, and the wind dropped by half, blocked by the pines, and the snow came down straight rather than sideways. And it was possible to look up and see the dark shapes of the forest and the faint difference where the sky was, heavy and gray-white and absolute. Almost there, Gideon said, from ahead of her. She didn't answer. She was looking at the trees. They were enormous. Old-growth pines, she thought, though she didn't know enough about trees to be certain. What she knew was that they'd been standing a long time before anyone built Frost Hollow, before anyone built anything in this part of the world, and they'd be standing after whatever happened here ran its course. There was something steadying about that, and something terrible about it simultaneously. The cabin appeared out of the dark in the way things in forests appear, not suddenly, but with a gradual accumulation of detail. First the smell of old wood smoke, then the shape of a structure against the tree line, then windows that had been dark but in which she now saw the banked ember glow of a fire that had been left to hold itself while he was away. It was larger than she'd expected. 2 stories, rough-hewn timber walls thick enough to matter, a covered porch that ran the width of the front, a stone chimney at each end. Not fine. Nothing about it was fine, but solid in a way that said the man who'd built it had thought about the mountains trying to knock it down and had built to argue the point. Gideon pulled up and dismounted and tied the gray to the porch rail and turned to help her down. She took his arm, not his hand, a small distinction that felt important to her, and stepped off the mare and stood on solid ground for the first time in 4 hours. Her legs felt unreliable. Her back had opinions. The cold had worked its way through everything, and her fingers had stopped being separate things, and were just a general problem at the end of her arms. "There's a bed in the back room," Gideon said. "Second door on the left. Fire should still be warm enough." He paused. "I'll see to the horses. You go get warm." May looked at the door. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. The second time she'd said it to him tonight, but this one felt different, heavier, more weighted. He nodded in that way he had, the slight downward movement of his chin that was apparently what he did instead of speaking, and turned to the horses. She went inside. The interior was one large room with a kitchen hearth at one end and a sitting area at the other, and a staircase against the left wall and 2 doors in the back wall. It smelled like wood smoke and pine resin and something that might have been coffee. The floor was rough-cut planking, swept clean. There was a table, heavy, handmade, the kind of table that took up space like it had a right to, and 2 chairs, and a braided rug in front of the hearth that had been made by someone with patience and nothing particularly decorative in mind. It was not a warm home in the way some homes are warm. There was nothing soft about it. No curtains at the windows, no pictures on the walls, no accumulation of the small decorative choices that people make over years when they're building a life rather than just maintaining one. But it was solid, and it was sheltered, and the embers in the hearth were alive enough that she could coax them, and when she pushed the second door on the left open, there was a small room with a bed, a real bed, not a bench, not a cot, with a thick quilt folded at its foot. She sat on the edge of the bed and took her boots off and looked at her feet for a long moment, making sure they were still the right color, still behaving. They were fine. They'd be fine. She lay down without undressing because she was too tired to manage it, and pulled the quilt over herself and lay in the dark of the small room in a cabin on a mountain in December with a man she'd known for 5 hours sleeping, probably, somewhere else in the same building. She waited to feel afraid. The fear didn't come. What came instead was exhaustion so total that it had its own quality of peace, the complete collapse of the energy required to worry. She was warm, she was horizontal, the wind outside was real, and the walls were holding it. "All right," she told Daniel in her head. "I don't know what this is, but I'm alive. We'll see about the rest." She was asleep in under a minute. Morning came as a pale gray light through a window with no curtain, and May woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of an axe. She lay still for a moment and let herself remember where she was, which took a moment because the last 24 hours had the quality of something that might have been dreamed. Then she got up and did what she could with her appearance, given that she had a hairbrush missing 3 tines, and the dress she'd slept in and 2 days' worth of exhaustion visible in her face, and she opened the door. The fire was going. Real fire, not embers. Someone had built it up while she slept. The coffee pot was on the hook over it. Outside, through the single window beside the front door, she could see Gideon in the yard splitting wood with a consistency that suggested he'd been at it for some time, his breath coming out in white clouds, his strokes even and unhurried. She poured coffee. The mug was tin, plain, and dented in 2 places. She wrapped both hands around it and stood by the hearth and looked at the room in morning light, looked at it as a place she was going to be living in, rather than just arriving in, which was a different kind of looking. There was more to it in daylight. She noticed a shelf of books against the far wall. Not many, maybe a dozen, but the presence of them was unexpected enough to snag her attention. She noticed that the table had a small repair on one leg where it had been broken and rejoined with iron strap work, done by someone who cared more about function than appearance. She noticed that the window was actually two panes, a small luxury in a frontier cabin that meant either the builder had been particular about something or had gotten lucky with the glass. The axe outside stopped. Gideon came in, stamping snow from his boots on the porch, and entered without looking at her immediately. The habit of a man who lived alone, used to a space that didn't rearrange itself overnight. He hung his coat on the peg by the door, and then turned and found her standing by the fire with her coffee, and stopped for the briefest moment before continuing to the kitchen end of the room. "Sleep all right?" he said. "Yes." She meant it. "You?" "Fine." He poured his own coffee. "The preacher, Harmon, he's at the Garner settlement 3 miles east. I'll ride over today, get the paperwork done." She'd almost let herself forget the practical structure of what this was. "All right, unless you've changed your mind." She looked at him across the room. He was watching her without any particular investment in what she answered, or if he had an investment, he wasn't showing it, which amounted to the same thing. "No," she said, "I haven't changed my mind." He nodded. She looked at the window. The snow had stopped overnight, and the mountain was visible for the first time, or she could see pieces of it through the trees, white and staggering in scale, the kind of landscape that made a person feel very precisely how small they were. "It's beautiful," she said, mostly to herself. Gideon followed her gaze out the window. He was quiet for a moment. "It tries to kill you 3 times a week," he said. "But yes." The ceremony was the simplest thing May had ever experienced. Harmon was 60 years old and largely practical about matters of spiritual ceremony, and he'd performed so many frontier marriages that he'd reduced the whole thing to its legal essentials. About 4 minutes of words, 2 signatures, 1 witness in the form of his wife Berta, who'd been doing laundry when they arrived and participated in the ceremony with her sleeves still rolled up. May signed her name as May Ashcroft in clear handwriting on the register and didn't let herself feel anything about it until later. On the ride back to the cabin, in the clean post-storm light with the snow throwing light off every surface and the pine trees throwing blue shadows across the white trail, she thought, "This is now what it is. I'm a married woman on a mountain I don't know, with a man I don't know, in conditions I've never experienced. That's the situation. Now what?" She'd always found that question useful. Not what does this mean or should I have done this, both of which were questions with no actionable answers. But now what, which at least had directions in it. Gideon was riding ahead of her on the trail. His back was straight and his hat was pulled against the glare, and he moved with the horse the way people do when they've been riding long enough that it stopped being a skill and become something closer to instinct. "What does a day here look like?" she called to him. He looked back over his shoulder. "Depends on the weather. Good weather? I'm in the timber from first light to mid-afternoon. Bad weather, I work closer to the cabin, shaped repairs, stacking, equipment." He turned front again. "The cabin work has been—" a pause. "Not maintained the way it should be." She heard what he wasn't saying in that, which was that he'd been living alone in a place designed for 2 and had probably been letting the domestic end of things go by default. Men who lived alone in remote places generally reached a stable floor of functionality below which they didn't let things fall, and then stopped. "I can see to the cabin," she said. "I know how to keep a house. What else needs doing?" He listed things as they rode. The fire, obviously, which needed management around the clock in this weather. The water supply, which came from a spring 20 yards behind the cabin and had to be checked morning and evening because it could ice over at the inlet. The food stores in the root cellar, which needed cataloging because he'd been honestly uncertain what was down there. A section of chinking on the north wall that had started to fail and was letting cold air in between logs. "The chinking I can do," she said. "I've done it before." She and Daniel had had a cabin in their first year of marriage, before the business went bad, and she'd learned most of what she knew about physical maintenance from that year. He glanced back at her again, briefly. "All right." She could tell the response surprised him slightly. Not in any large way, just a small recalibration, like a man adjusting his estimate of a thing when the thing turns out to be different than expected. She filed that away. The cabin came back into view through the trees. All right, May thought. This is home now. Make it work. She didn't know yet what make it work was going to cost her. She didn't know about the storms that were coming, or the silences that would stretch for days, or the ways the isolation would work on her like something slow and quiet, testing seams she didn't know she had. She knew the walls were solid and the fire was real, and the man she'd married had paid her debt and built up the fire while she slept. That was enough to start with. She rode into the yard of the cabin that was now her home and dismounted and tied the roan and looked up at the mountain above the tree line, white and enormous and indifferent to everything she was, and felt, not peace, not yet, but the first small ember of something that might become it. She went inside to find out what needed doing. The first week was mostly about learning where things were. May discovered the root cellar on her second morning when she pried open the hatch beside the back porch and climbed down into the dark with a lantern and found what amounted to Gideon's entire relationship with planning ahead, which was, it turned out, meticulous in some areas and completely absent in others. There were dried beans in quantities that suggested he'd expected to outlast a siege. There was salt pork, well wrapped, and two types of grain she couldn't immediately identify, and enough dried apple rings to suggest he'd had a productive fall. But the organization of it made no sense to her. Things stacked by apparent accident rather than any logic of use or preservation. A crock of lard sitting directly on the dirt floor where it could absorb cold and go grainy. A bag of flour with a small hole near the bottom where something had been investigating it. She spent most of that day rearranging the cellar. She didn't ask permission. It needed doing, and she was the one who'd seen it, which seemed like reason enough. When Gideon came in at mid-afternoon, earlier than usual, she'd learn, because a brief clearing had turned back to cloud, and he'd read it as the leading edge of another storm. He found her at the table with the flour bag, stitching the hole closed with thread from a small kit she'd kept in her coat pocket for months, because small repairs were the kind of thing that always needed doing. He looked at the bag, looked at her. Root cellar needed sorting, she said, without looking up from the stitch. A pause. I know. The lard was sitting on bare ground. I know that too. She tied off the thread and cut it and looked at him. I reorganized it. Things are in order of use now. Things we'll need most through winter at the front, long storage toward the back. The flour's up on the shelf now. I used 2 boards from the woodpile that had warped past usefulness for burning, just to get it off the ground. He was watching her with that quality of attention he had. Not intense exactly, but thorough, like someone reading carefully rather than scanning. All right, he said. You don't mind? Why would I mind? She wasn't sure how to answer that. She'd lived in other people's spaces long enough that the question of what she was and wasn't permitted to touch had become a reflex. The truth was, she'd half expected him to come in and find an objection to what she'd done, not because he'd given her any particular reason to expect that, but because expecting objections had become a survival strategy. I wasn't sure, she said honestly. He took off his coat and hung it and moved to the fire to warm his hands. If something needs doing and you can do it, he said. This is your house. Your house. The words were practically spoken, just words that described a legal and practical reality, but they landed somewhere in May's chest and stayed there like something warm. She didn't say anything. She put the flour bag back on the shelf she'd cleared for it and started thinking about supper. The storm Gideon had predicted came in around 4 in the afternoon and committed to the work. 3 solid days of wind and snow that pressed against the cabin walls and made the trees creak in ways that sounded structural even when they weren't. May learned the fire during those 3 days. Not in theory, she'd known how to maintain a fire since childhood, but in the specific demanding way of this particular hearth, with its particular draft patterns and its tendency to pull left in high wind and its requirement for a specific arrangement of larger and smaller logs that took her 2 days to figure out and 1 failed night to confirm. The night the fire went wrong, she woke at 2 in the morning to a room that had dropped to a temperature she felt immediately even through the quilt. She got up and found the hearth down to a single struggling ember and spent the next 40 minutes on her knees in the dark, doing the careful, patient work of bringing it back from almost nothing. Shredded bark first, then finger-sized sticks, blowing carefully, not too hard, not enough to scatter the ash that was holding the heat, reading the fire the way you'd read a sick person's face for signs of recovery. It came back, eventually. She was sitting on the braided rug in front of the rebuilt fire, warming through, when Gideon appeared at the top of the stairs. He looked at her, looked at the fire, looked at the state of the room. "It went out," she said before he could ask. "I should have shown you the night banking," he said. He came down the stairs. "There's a method. You pack the ash a particular way, keeps a core going 8-10 hours. Show me now." He did. He crouched beside the hearth and demonstrated, talking through it in a low, direct way. Not patient in a condescending manner, but patient in the manner of someone who understood that information needed to be given at a speed that could be received. She watched his hands. She asked 2 questions, both specific. He answered them without elaborating unnecessarily. When he was done, he sat back on his heels and looked at the fire. "You brought it back yourself," he said. "Barely, but you did it." He looked at her sideways. "A lot of people would have woken me. You were asleep. That wouldn't stop most people." She looked at the fire. "I wasn't going to wake you for something I could manage myself." A pause. "I was going to wake you if the cabin burned down." He made a sound that she identified after a moment as a laugh. Brief, genuinely surprised, gone almost before she was certain it had happened. It changed his face in a way that caught her off guard, the same way seeing an unfamiliar room open off a house you thought you knew could catch you off guard. "That's a reasonable standard," he said. He went back upstairs. She stayed by the fire until she was certain it had enough momentum to maintain itself, and then she went back to bed. She lay in the dark for a while. She was thinking about the laugh, not with any romantic intention. She wasn't there, and she was self-aware enough to know it, but with the specific interest of someone cataloging information about a person she was going to be living in close proximity with for a very long time. She was building a picture, piece by piece, the books on the shelf, the deliberate stacking of the woodpile, the scar above his eye, the way he'd paid Hank Cutter's money down on the bar without any theater, the way he'd said your house like it was obvious. She didn't know what the picture would show when it was complete, but she was paying attention. That, at least, was something she was good at. The storm broke on the 4th day into an absolute stillness, the kind that follows major weather, when the world has exhausted itself and everything goes quiet simultaneously. May was outside within an hour of the wind stopping, working through what needed to be dug out and assessed. One section of the porch railing had gone, sheared off by a fallen branch that had since disappeared into the snowbank beneath it. A shutter on the north-facing window had come loose at the bottom hinge. The woodpile had drifted half-buried and needed clearing around the base so the wood could breathe. She was working at the porch rail with a handsaw she'd found in the shed when she heard Gideon's footsteps behind her. "I was going to get that," he said. "I know," she said, and kept sawing. The broken section needed to come off cleanly before it could be replaced. "You were going to do the timber assessment first. I saw you head toward the north stand." A pause. "The Harker section might have ice damage." "I figured." She finished the cut, set the broken railing section aside. "I can do the porch. You do the timber. More useful that way." He stood there for a moment in the way he sometimes stood when something had shifted slightly from what he'd anticipated. She'd noticed he did this. Not a long pause, just a beat, a brief recalibration. "You know how to do porch rail?" he asked. "I know how to do most things that need doing," she said. "Might not do them the same way you would, but they'll hold." He was quiet a moment more. Then, "There's seasoned pine in the shed, 3rd stack from the left." "Thank you." He left toward the timber stand. May went to find the seasoned pine. She spent 4 hours on the porch rail. It didn't look elegant when she was done. The replacement section was slightly different in color from the original, and the cuts weren't as clean as a carpenter would have made them, but it was solid, and she tested it by leaning her full weight against it from different angles, and it didn't move. When Gideon came back in late afternoon, he stepped up onto the porch and put his hand on the new section without saying anything. Tested it the same way she had, weighed against it, checking the join. "Good," he said. It was a single word. May had learned by then that from Gideon Ashcroft, good was not a throwaway. He didn't say things he didn't mean, which also meant that everything he said carried its actual weight, rather than the inflated weight of a person who'd never understood that language could be cheapened by overuse. "How's the timber?" she asked. 3 trees down. 1 salvageable for lumber, 2 are not." He pulled the door open and held it, which she noticed because it was the first time he'd done it. A small automatic courtesy that had either always been there and she was only now seeing it, or had arrived from somewhere in the last 10 days without announcement. "Supper?" "Beans and salt pork," she said. "I found the smoked onions in the cellar, so it won't be completely without mercy." He actually smiled at that. Not the brief surprise thing from the night by the fire, but a fuller thing, more deliberate, that settled into his face like it had been there before and remembered the way back. May walked past him into the cabin and did not examine why that smile made something in her chest do what it did. She started supper. He washed up and sat at the table. They ate mostly in silence, which she had mostly stopped interpreting as hostility and had started understanding was simply how he was. That silence for Gideon Ashcroft wasn't absence, but a kind of presence, the way some rooms are fuller when they're quiet than when someone's filling them with noise. Halfway through the meal, he said, "You've done this before?" She looked up. "Eaten supper?" "Living rough," he said. Not unkind, just direct, the way he put things. "You know how to manage things. The cellar, the fire, the rail. You're not learning it from nothing." She set her spoon down and thought about how to answer that. "Daniel, my husband, we had a place the first year. Nothing like this, but small and outside town, and we did most of the maintenance ourselves. He was bad with tools, genuinely, almost offensively bad, so I learned by necessity." She paused. "And then the business went wrong and we lost the place and we moved to town and I spent 2 years doing other people's houses instead." Gideon was listening with his full attention in that way he had. He didn't fill the silence when she stopped. "He was a good man," she said. "He was impractical in ways that caused real problems. And he trusted people past the point where trusting them made sense, and he died of a fever that a doctor might have caught earlier if we'd had the money for a doctor." She picked her spoon back up. "I don't say that to make you feel sorry. I say it because it's accurate. He was good, and he made things hard, and I loved him, and he's gone, and the rest of it is the rest of it." "How long?" 14 months. He nodded once. He didn't say "I'm sorry" or "that must have been hard" or any of the reflexive things people said, which she'd found she preferred. After a moment, he said, "My father died when I was 16. Winter. Same kind of thing." A pause that had a different texture to it than his usual pauses. "The business I took over from him when I came out here, the timber claim, was his idea. He'd been saving toward it for years." May looked at him. He was looking at his bowl. "I didn't know that," she said. "No reason you would." He picked up his spoon again. "But it's why I'm not going to let a lumber company take it, if that's useful context." It was. She thought about the land claim and the assessor arriving in spring and the 4 years he'd been up here maintaining a provisional status that a legal marriage would make permanent. And she thought about a man saving toward a dream and dying before he got there, and his son coming out to the mountain alone to finish the work. "I understand," she said. They finished supper. He washed the dishes. She'd learned that was his habit. She cooked, he cleaned. It had arrived at that arrangement by a kind of natural gravity rather than any explicit negotiation. And she sat at the table with the small book of poems she'd brought from Frost Hollow, the one she hadn't opened in the 6 weeks she'd been sleeping on a bench, because she hadn't had the energy for anything that required feeling things. She opened it now. She was reading when she heard him say, from the kitchen end of the room, "What is it?" She looked up. He was drying a pot and looking at the book from across the room. "Poetry," she said. "Robert Frost, mostly, and some others." He was quiet a moment. "Would you read one?" It wasn't quite a question. She looked at him to see if he was serious. He was drying the pot with the same equanimity he applied to everything. She looked back at the book and found a page she'd read enough times to know, and read it out loud in the warm room with the fire going and the snow outside doing whatever snow did after a storm. And Gideon finished the dishes and sat in the other chair and listened with his hands on his knees and his eyes somewhere in the middle distance. And for a while the only other sound was the fire and the vast quiet of the mountain. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment. "Again," he said. She read it again. That became a thing they did. She hadn't expected it, and she didn't examine it too carefully, but in the evenings when the work was done and the fire was solid and the world outside had shut down to just wind and dark, she would read and he would listen. and it was the first thing in 14 months that had felt like rest rather than just sleep. The hardest thing was the loneliness, and it was complicated because she was never actually alone. She'd expected solitude on the mountain. She'd expected the specific loneliness of a remote place with one other person and no community, no voices passing outside a window, no incidental humanity of town life. The baker's wife calling to someone across the street, children arguing, a horse's indignant commentary on something. She'd expected the silence of the mountains, and she'd gotten it. What she hadn't expected was how different loneliness felt when it was being experienced next to someone who was experiencing it too. Because Gideon was lonely. She saw it in the way he sometimes stood at the window in the evening looking at nothing, and in the way the books on his shelf were worn in a manner that suggested he'd read some of them so many times the spines had given up, and in the fractional way his posture changed when she walked into a room. The almost imperceptible adjustment of someone who had been in a space alone and was now in a space that wasn't empty. He'd been up here for 4 years. The Garner settlement 3 miles east was 3 families in Harmon and Berta and a couple of young men who worked Garner's claim, and none of them were what you'd call his people. She didn't raise any of this. It wasn't something that could be raised without becoming something else. But she knew what she was seeing because she'd been living with the same thing in herself long enough to recognize it from the outside. 3 weeks in, she patched the north wall chinking. This took most of a day and was genuinely unpleasant work in the cold, chipping out the failed material and working in the fresh, her fingers stiffening despite the rags she'd wrapped around them, the cold air coming through the gaps in a persistent, personal way. She worked systematically across the section, 6 feet of wall, taking it a foot at a time. Gideon came around the corner of the cabin in the early afternoon and stopped when he found her halfway up a makeshift ladder she'd assembled from a split log and 2 pine branches, eye level with the upper part of the wall. "What are you doing?" he said. It was not entirely a question. "Chinking," she said. "You mentioned it needed—" "I was going to do that." "I know." She pressed fresh chinking into the gap in front of her. "You were going to do it when you had time." "You haven't had time. Cold's been getting in. I had time today." He stood there looking at her on the ladder with an expression she couldn't fully read, which was becoming something of a pattern. He had more expressions than she'd initially credited him with. She just had to look carefully to see them. "That ladder's not safe," he said. "It's fine." "It is absolutely not fine." She looked down at the arrangement beneath her. She had, now that she studied it from a height, perhaps been optimistic about the structural reliability of 2 pine branches. "It's held so far." May. There it was, her name in a particular register, the tone that meant he had used up his capacity for watching her do something he considered a hazard. "Get down and I'll hold the actual ladder from the shed." She got down. He got the ladder from the shed and held it while she worked. They didn't talk much during it, but at one point she reached for the bucket of chinking material and found it closer to her hand than it had been, and she looked down and found him having moved it without comment. Small things. She was building her picture from small things, the same way she'd built the fire back from almost nothing. A piece at a time, carefully, not forcing it. By late afternoon, the section was done, and the cold that had been finding its way through the north wall had nowhere to go. That evening, she could feel the difference, the room holding its temperature an hour longer than it had been. She was at the table darning a pair of socks she'd found in the cedar chest. Gideon's socks, both heels gone, clearly months abandoned to a pile, when he came in and stopped and stood for a moment. "Warmer," he said. "North wall's sealed." He looked at her. He looked at the sock on her hand, the darning needle, the careful crosshatch she was building across the gap. Something moved across his face. "Those are mine," he said. "I can tell. Your feet are enormous." She kept darning. "They're also unwearable. You were going to get frostbite." He didn't say anything. "I'm not your maid," she said. She kept her voice level. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not doing this because it's my job or because I owe you something for paying the debt. I'm doing it because we're both living here and both sets of feet should work properly." She looked up. "Do you understand the distinction?" He looked at her for a long moment with whatever was behind his eyes that she hadn't fully mapped yet. "Yes," he said. "Good." She went back to the sock. "There are 2 more pairs in that chest that are nearly as bad. I'll get to them tomorrow." He sat down in the chair across from her. After a while, he picked up the small whetstone from the shelf behind him and started sharpening the axe blade he'd brought in from the cold, the quiet rasp of it, a kind of counterpoint to the needle pull of the darning. They sat like that until the fire needed tending, working at their separate things in the same room, and outside the mountain was doing what it always did and always would, enormous and indifferent and coldly, genuinely beautiful. And inside the cabin, something without a name was adding one more layer to whatever structure it was quietly becoming. May didn't name it. She was 48 cents and a dead man's name and a frozen street away from the woman who'd stood in the storm, and she'd learned that some things did better when you let them grow without watching them too hard. She finished the sock and set it on the table and started the second one. The fire crackled. The axe blade whispered against the stone. The walls held. The morning of the storm that changed everything started, like most mornings had started for the past 6 weeks. May but at the fire before full light. Gideon already dressed and moving through the kitchen end of the cabin with the particular efficiency of a man who'd spent years making the same sequence of early morning decisions and had reduced them to something close to reflex. The difference was the sky. May noticed it when she went to check the spring before breakfast, pulling on her coat and boots and stepping out onto the porch into air that had a specific quality she'd learned to pay attention to. Not colder than usual, but pressurized somehow, weighted, the way air feels in the moment before something large announces itself. The pines were still. That was the thing that registered first. Absolute stillness. Not a branch moving, not the background creak that the trees usually maintained even in calm weather. The mountain above the tree line was invisible behind a ceiling of clouds so low and uniform, it looked less like weather and more like the sky had simply ended 50 feet above the ground. She stood on the porch for a moment looking at it. "It's too quiet," she said when she came back inside. Gideon was eating standing up, the way he did when he was planning to leave quickly. He looked at her over his coffee mug. "I know. That's a bad sign, the stillness." "Yes." "Then why are you eating standing up?" He set the mug down. "Because there are 3 trees in the north stand that came loose in the last storm, and they're leaning into each other right now. If this weather hits before I get the tension ropes on them, they'll come down on the equipment shed." He picked up the mug again. "I'll be back before noon." May looked at him. She'd learned his particular brand of stubbornness well enough by now to know that arguing with a practical decision was different from arguing with an irrational one, and this was not entirely irrational. Timber equipment was their livelihood, or would become spring, and he understood the risk calculus better than she did. "Before noon," she said. "Before noon," he confirmed, and put his coat on and went out. She watched him cross the yard and disappear into the trees, and then she went back inside and started the serious work of getting the cabin ready for whatever that sky was preparing to deliver. She brought in wood first, as much as she could stack along the interior wall without blocking movement through the room. 2 hours of work, back and forth from the woodpile. She checked the spring and the chinking on the north wall and made sure the shutter latches were set properly, and filled every available container with water in case the spring iced over its intake during the storm. She made a pot of stew and left it on the low hook to keep warm, because experience had taught her that the time after a storm passed was never the moment you wanted to discover there was nothing ready to eat. She worked efficiently, and she didn't let herself watch the window too closely, because watching the window wouldn't help anything and would cost her concentration she needed elsewhere. Noon came. The sky and the time she'd been working had descended further. Not dramatically, not the sudden dramatic darkening of a summer thunderstorm, but steadily, patiently, the way serious winter weather moved. The cloud ceiling was at the treetops now. The stillness had acquired a new quality, the stillness of pressure building rather than pressure absent. Gideon hadn't come back. She told herself this was fine. She told herself he knew this mountain, had been on it 4 years, had survived 4 winters up here before she'd arrived with her 48 cents and her dead husband's name and complicated expectations about what help from strangers meant. He knew the north stand. He knew the trail back. She told herself this at 10 past noon and at 20 past noon and at noon plus 40 minutes when the first real movement in the air arrived. Not wind exactly, more a long, slow exhalation from somewhere very large. And the trees began to stir. At 1 o'clock, she put her coat on and stood on the porch. The snow started coming at 5 past 1. Not gently. There was nothing exploratory about it. It came down in the sudden, committed way of a storm that had been organizing itself for days and had now arrived at the appointed place and intended to conduct its business thoroughly. Within 10 minutes, the yard was being actively re-landscaped. Within 20, the tree line was a suggestion rather than a visible thing, the pines becoming shapes and then impressions of shapes, and then just the general concept of trees somewhere in that direction. May stood on the porch long past the point where standing on the porch was useful, scanning the direction of the North Stand Trail until she had to acknowledge that she could not see the trail, that she could barely see the near edge of the yard, and that whatever information she was going to get about Gideon Ashcroft's whereabouts was not going to come from standing out here. She went inside. She put a log on the fire. She sat down at the table and she made herself think rather than feel, because feeling right now was not going to help. The North Stand was approximately a half-mile from the cabin. On a clear day, 20 minutes of walking. In this storm, in the timber, where the snow was coming down hard enough to obscure landmarks, and the wind had arrived now in earnest and was rewriting the topography of every trail, longer. How much longer depended on variables she couldn't calculate from inside the cabin. He had tools. He knew the terrain. He had done this 4 years. Those were the facts she had. She arranged them in a row in her head and she looked at them, and they were true, and they were also insufficient. She got up and checked the fire. She went back to the table. She picked up the book of poems and put it back down without opening it. She went to the window and looked at the specific nothing of a full blizzard at midday, which looked like a wall of white cloth pressed against the glass from outside. At 2:30 she heard the door. Not knocking, just the latch moving. The door pushed against its frame from outside, and then again, harder. And then the wind got involved, and it came open all at once, with a crack that sent snow across the room in a wave. May was on her feet and across the cabin in the time it took for Gideon to come through the door, and she understood immediately that something was wrong because he wasn't moving right. He was upright. That registered first, and she let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. But he was moving with the effortful, compensating motion of someone whose body had sustained damage and was working around it. His left hand was pressed against the right side of his chest, and his coat was dark in a way that wasn't ice or meltwater. May got the door closed against the wind and turned and looked at him in the firelight. The blood had soaked through his coat and through the shirt beneath it, and had dried partially in the cold and was still wet in the center. It was a significant amount of blood. She had enough experience with injury. Frontier life did not permit squeamishness about the body's capacity to make a mess of itself, to make an immediate assessment that was serious without being, she told herself firmly, necessarily fatal. "Sit down," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her slightly. "It's not—" "Sit down, Gideon." He sat at the table. He was pale beneath the cold red of his face, and she could see the particular quality of his stillness now was different from his usual stillness. This was the stillness of a man managing pain rather than a man simply at rest. "What happened?" she said, already moving. To the water she'd heated for the stew, to the clean rags she kept folded by the kitchen basin, to the small medicine box she'd found in the first days and inventoried and been relieved to find containing, among other things, a needle and surgical thread. "Tension rope on the second tree gave when I was cutting the—" He stopped, and she heard him breathe carefully, the cautious breath of someone whose chest had reasons to complain about deep inhalation. "The end kicked, caught the saw." "The saw," she said. "Yes." She came to the table with the water and the rags and said, "Coat off." He moved to take it off, and the movement cost him something visible. Not a sound, but a white compression around his mouth that she was beginning to understand was what Gideon Ashcroft did instead of making sounds when things hurt badly. She helped him get the coat off his right side without pulling the left arm through all the way, and then the shirt, or what remained of the shirt, on the right side. The wound was below his right collarbone and ran diagonally toward his side. A saw wound, from a saw blade catching and dragging. Not a clean cut, not the neat edge of a blade going straight through, but a torn open thing, several inches long and deep enough that she could not let herself think about how deep, because thinking about that right now was not useful. It had bled heavily and was still bleeding slowly, and the cold had actually done the minor mercy of slowing that somewhat during his walk back. She looked at it for exactly as long as she needed to look at it to understand what she was dealing with, and then she started working. "This is going to need stitching," she said. "I know." I've done it before. On a person, I mean. Not. It wasn't a doctor, but I know the method. She was cleaning around the wound with the hot water, working carefully, removing what needed to be removed without pulling at the wound itself. Daniel cut himself badly with an adze once. Deep. We were too far from town to get to a doctor in time, so I did it. How did it go? He was watching her face rather than what her hands were doing, which she thought was probably a reasonable choice. He survived, she said. The scar was ugly, but he always said it built character. Something moved in his expression. All right, he said. This is going to hurt significantly. I expect so. Don't move. I won't. She believed him. She threaded the needle by firelight. Her hands were steady. She made them be steady. This was not the moment for hands that weren't steady. And she looked at the wound once more, and she started. He did not move. He made no sound. She worked in the firelight with the snow hammering the cabin from all sides, and the wind finding every seam it could argue with, and she stitched the wound closed with the careful, deliberate technique she'd learned in a desperate hour years ago and had never expected to need again. Each stitch required a decision, placement, tension, the distance between. And she made each decision cleanly without second-guessing herself, because second-guessing was a luxury that had no place in what she was currently doing. Twice the needle slipped on the slick of blood, and she had to stop and dry it on the cloth and begin again. Once she reached a section of the wound where the depth was greater than she'd estimated from the surface, and she had to breathe through her own response to that before continuing. She could feel Gideon's muscle under her fingers, could feel the fine tremor running through him that he was working hard to suppress, the body insisting on its reaction to pain, even while the man in charge of the body was refusing to acknowledge it. Talk to me, she said halfway through. Not because she needed to hear him, because she needed to know he was conscious, and because the tension in the room was the kind that needed something in it besides the fire and the storm. A beat. About what? Anything. Another stitch. The north stand. Tell me about the trees. A pause while he organized breath and words, and then he spoke, slowly, carefully, the way you speak when speaking requires management, about the timber stand and the specific trees he'd been working, about the tension ropes and why the second tree had been the problem, about the way the old-growth pine grew in that section with root systems that had been competing for 200 years and had shaped the wood's grain in ways that made certain cuts unpredictable. He talked about it with the quiet authority of a man who knew his subject completely, who'd spent years learning it not from books, but from the specific education of being wrong about something and paying for it and adjusting. She let his voice be what it was, low, deliberate, continuous, and she stitched. When she was finished, she sat back and looked at the closed wound by firelight, and it was not pretty work. She wouldn't claim otherwise, but it was solid, and it was closed, and the bleeding had stopped. She covered it with the cleanest cloth she had and bound it against his chest with strips torn from a shirt that was beyond further use anyway. Done, she said. He exhaled, carefully. She realized her hands were shaking. She put them flat on her thighs under the table and waited for them to stop. May. His voice was different, still low, but the managed quality was gone from it, something more unguarded in its place. She looked up. His eyes were on her face with an attention that was different from his usual attention, more open, as if the pain had removed some habitual layer. That was... He stopped. Don't, she said, not unkindly. I don't need you to... Just sit. I'm going to get you something to eat, and then you need to be horizontal. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're vertical because you're too stubborn to be anything else, but that's not the same thing as fine. He looked at her. Eat first, she said, then bed. He ate. She kept the bowl filled and didn't let him see how closely she was watching him for the things she didn't want to see. Gray skin going grayer, or the particular blankness that came with blood loss crossing a threshold. He stayed present. The color in his face was coming back in small increments as the warmth of the cabin and the food and the absence of cold worked on him. She ate standing at the kitchen end because she didn't trust herself to sit still. Outside, the storm had found its full voice. This was not the daily weather of the mountain, the routine hostility that she'd come to know and factor in. This was something else. The kind of storm that had its own name in the memory of the people who survived it, that came up once or twice in a winter bad enough to be remembered for years. The windows flexed in the wind. The fire drew sideways when a gust found the chimney from above. The sound was not a sound exactly, but a pressure, a continuous physical fact that surrounded the cabin and pressed. May cleaned up what needed cleaning with quick, efficient movements and then stood at the center of the room and looked at the man sitting at her table with his right side bound and his face still carrying the effort of the past few hours. And she thought about the wound and the needle and the way her hands had been steady when she'd needed them to be. And she felt something that wasn't satisfaction and wasn't pride, but was somewhere in that neighborhood. A recognition, specific and quiet, of what she'd found out about herself tonight. "Come on," she said. She helped him up the stairs. He needed the help, which cost him something. She could feel it in the rigidity of his posture and the careful way he managed every step. And down the short hall to his room, which she'd never been in. It was what she'd have predicted, sparse, clean, a quilt on the bed that had been made by someone else's hands at some earlier point in his life, a coat hanging on the wall peg, a pair of boots set precisely parallel at the foot of the bed. She got him horizontal. He was asleep, or as close to it as he could get, before she'd reached the door. She went back downstairs and put a large log on the fire and banked it the way he'd taught her, the ash packed carefully around the core, and she pulled the braided rug closer to the hearth and sat on it with her back against the chair and her knees drawn up, and she listened to the storm conduct its business. Her hands had stopped shaking. She thought about the beginning of this, the storm in Frost Hollow, the post she'd been holding, the lantern coming through the snow. She thought about the diner table and the 48 cents and the conditions she'd laid out in her plain voice and he'd agreed to without negotiating. She thought about your house and books worn past their spines and the brief, genuine laugh by the fire at 2 a.m. She thought about the needle and the way he'd talked about timber to give her something to work against, and she understood that in his way, in the way available to a man who'd spent 4 years alone on a mountain and had gotten thoroughly out of the practice of needing people, that had been an act of trust. He'd given her something to hold on to so she could do what needed doing. She put her head back against the chair and looked at the fire. The storm outside was enormous, and the cabin was small, and the man upstairs was hurt and would need to be watched through the night to make sure the wound held and the fever she was already expecting didn't run away with him. She had a long night ahead of her, and she knew it. She also knew, with the particular certainty that came not from thinking but from somewhere older and more reliable than thought, that she was going to get through it. Not because there wasn't anything to be afraid of. There was. The wound was real. The storm was real. The isolation was as real as it had ever been, and more pressing now than it had been before. But she was the woman who had rebuilt a fire from almost nothing at 2 a.m. She was the woman who'd stitched a wound closed by firelight in a blizzard with steady hands. She was May Ashcroft on a mountain in the worst storm of the year, and the walls were holding and the fire was burning and she was not done. She got up and put the kettle on for the night's first watch, and settled in to wait for whatever the storm was going to bring next. The fever arrived at midnight, the way fevers did. Not with announcement, but with a gradual shift in the quality of his breathing that May heard from the bottom of the stairs, where she'd been sitting with her back against the wall and the kettle warm beside her, letting herself rest without fully sleeping. She went up. He was on his back the way she'd left him, but the stillness was different now. Restless rather than exhausted. His body working against itself with the low-grade urgency of infection beginning its argument. She touched the back of her hand to his forehead and found what she'd expected. Heat that was beyond the normal heat of a body warming back up after cold exposure, the particular dry burn of a fever establishing itself. "Gideon." She said it quietly, testing his level of consciousness. His eyes opened. Not fully, not with the sharp immediacy of a man who'd been awake, but with the slow, reluctant focus of someone being pulled back from somewhere that had been, if not pleasant, at least without pain. "May, you've got a fever. I need you to drink." She had water, and she had willow bark, which she'd found in the medicine box, and which she had limited but real confidence in, and she had the straightforward stubbornness that had gotten her through everything else this night. She got him drinking, not easily. He tried twice to say he was fine, and twice she waited without arguing until the silence became more effort than compliance, and then he drank. She stayed. That was the whole of the next several hours. She stayed. She sat in the chair she'd dragged from downstairs and placed beside the bed, and she managed the fever with water and willow bark and cool rags and the refusal to let it run unopposed. She checked the wound by lamplight and found it holding. The stitching was intact, and the skin around it was inflamed, but not in the spreading, alarming way that meant something had gone deeply wrong. It was angry. It was also closed. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, he became more conscious than he'd been and found her in the chair beside him and looked at her with eyes that were clearer than they'd been at midnight. "You should sleep," he said. His voice was rough. "I will." "That's not an answer to what I said." "I know." He looked at the ceiling. The lamp was turned low, and the room had the particular intimacy of any space at that hour. The way 3 in the morning made the walls feel closer and everything more plainly what it was. "How bad is the fever?" "Manageable," she said. "I've been managing it." "You've been up all night?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm had dropped somewhat. Not gone, but reduced from its earlier sustained ferocity to something more intermittent, the wind coming in long gusts with stretches of relative quiet between them. "May," he said. "Don't thank me," she said, the same way she'd said it the night before. "Just drink what I give you, and don't move more than you have to." He turned his head to look at her. In the low lamplight, with the fever making his face look slightly more exposed than usual, she could see things in his expression that the daylight and the activity of regular life generally didn't surface. Something unguarded. Something that had been there a while, she thought, being held in careful check by a man who'd built his life around not requiring things from people. "I want to say something," he said. She waited. "When I was coming back from the stand," he stopped, organized himself. "The last part of the trail, the half-mile, I couldn't. The cold and the blood loss, I wasn't." He paused again. "I wasn't certain I was going to make it to the door. And the thing I kept thinking about wasn't the timber or the deed or any of it." He looked at her directly. "I kept thinking that there were things I hadn't said. To you. And I didn't like that." May sat with that. "What things?" she said, carefully. "What you've done here. What you've become here." He was working for the words in the way he worked for things that didn't come easily to him, with effort and without apology for the effort. "I made you an arrangement, a business transaction, and you took it, and you made something out of it that I didn't have the right to expect. The cellar, the wall, the rail, the way you manage the fire, the way you read in the evenings, and you never—" He stopped. "You never made me feel like this was less than a real life. And I know I know what I am to live with. I'm not an easy man." "No," she agreed. "You're not." Something flickered across his face. "I know that." "I'm not an easy woman," she said. "I have opinions about things, and I say them, and I don't ask for space when I've decided something needs doing. That's probably harder to live with than silence." "It's not," he said. And then, after a pause that had something fragile in it, "It's the best thing about this house." May looked at the wall for a moment. She was doing the thing she sometimes did, putting the feeling somewhere it could be felt without it running things, giving it a designated location so it didn't leak into her face or her voice more than she intended. "Rest," she said. "We can talk when you're not running a fever. Things said at 3 in the morning in this condition don't count. They count. Rest, Gideon." He closed his eyes. He was asleep again within minutes, which was the correct outcome and also slightly frustrating. But she sat with the frustration and the warmth underneath it and watched his breathing even out. And eventually his fever began to drop towards something that let her breathe more fully herself. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair, and she watched, and she kept the lamp low and the water close, and she thought about what he'd said, and she thought about the trail in the dark, and a man walking half a mile through a blizzard with blood soaking through his coat and holding himself together by force of will alone. And she thought about what it meant that the thing he'd held on to was the thought of things unsaid. She thought about Daniel, who had always said everything immediately and loudly and with complete conviction and had died with nothing unspoken between them, which she'd once thought was the only way to live. She was revising that assessment. There were apparently other ways. The storm was quiet by 4 in the morning and entirely stopped by 5, with the particular sudden cessation that meant it had finished rather than paused. Dawn came up gray and then gold through the window at the end of the hall, and May finally let herself close her eyes in the chair and slept in 40-minute pieces until full morning. He woke at 9 with the fever considerably reduced and enough presence of mind to be embarrassed about his level of helplessness the night before, which she could tell from the particular set of his jaw when she came in with water and bread and found him attempting to sit up on his own. "Don't," she said. "I need to—" "Whatever you need to do, you can do more of it if you rest now and damage the stitching less." She set the bread and water on the small table beside the bed. The storm stopped. The cabin is fine. The woodpile isn't going anywhere. Eat. He ate. He was a bad patient in the specific way of men who'd spent too long being entirely self-sufficient, not uncooperative exactly, but constitutionally resistant to the position of being the one who needed managing rather than doing the managing. She understood it because she had the same tendency and had been fighting it in herself for the past 2 months. "The wound looks clean," she said when she checked it in the morning light, replacing the dressing with careful hands. "No spreading inflammation. The fever broke somewhere around 5. You were up all night. We've been through this." "May, Gideon." She tied off the fresh binding and looked at him directly. "I stayed up because the situation required it, and because I was capable of it, and because you would have done exactly the same thing. We're not going to make a large event out of it." He looked at her. There it was again. That more open quality she'd seen at 3 in the morning, still present in daylight, the fever having taken down something that he usually kept in place without appearing to. "All right," he said, "but I want you to sleep today. I'll sleep when I'm tired." "You're tired now." "I'm functional," she said, which was true if not entirely honest, and she picked up the old dressing and the basin and went back downstairs, where she was tired in the deep way that ran below the level of ordinary fatigue, a tiredness that lived in the back of the eyes and the base of the skull and required more than a night's sleep to properly address. She managed it. She was practiced at managing it. The recovery took 9 days. Not smooth, not a steady improvement, 2 days of genuine progress, then a setback when the inflammation around the wound site flared and the fever came back smaller but persistent for another 30 hours. Then gradual improvement that she measured not in grand gestures, but in the specific calibrations of a person monitoring something carefully. The color of the wound, the quality of his breathing when he moved, the return of appetite, the point where he stopped moving like someone who was managing pain and started moving like someone who'd recently had pain and was past the worst of it. She managed the cabin alone during this time, and she found that she could. That was not a small discovery. The water, the fire, the food, the woodpile that needed to be dug out after the storm, the porch roof that had taken on a load of snow that needed knocking down before the weight became structural. She worked through it all, one thing at a time, from before light to after dark. And it was hard in the way that genuine physical labor and genuine cold was hard, and she did it. On the 4th day, she was splitting kindling in the yard when she heard him on the porch. She turned. He was standing at the porch rail, her porch rail, the one she'd replaced, with his coat on and his color mostly back, and he was watching her with his hands on the rail and the early light on his face. "You're supposed to be inside," she said. "I've been inside for 4 days." "You've been inside for 4 days because of a saw wound and a fever." "I know what I've been inside for." He looked at the yard, the cleared perimeter, the freshly restacked wood. "You've done all of this." She split a piece of kindling. "It needed doing." May. The way he said her name had developed a specific quality in the past weeks that she'd noticed and not commented on, like the word itself was doing something additional to what names usually did. "Come inside when you're done. I want to talk." She looked at him. His face was serious in the particular way it got when he'd been thinking about something for a while and had decided to put the thinking into words. "I'll come in," she said. She finished the kindling and stacked it and went inside and found him at the table with 2 mugs of coffee, which meant he'd been at the stove, which she would have argued against if the coffee wasn't already there and already welcome. She sat across from him. "I've been lying in that room thinking," he said without preamble. "I assumed. The arrangement we made. In the diner. In Frost Hollow." He looked at his mug. "I told you that you'd be free to leave in spring, when the pass opens." She felt something go careful inside her. You did. I want to tell you that the offer stands. He looked up. Not as a reminder, not because I want you to go. He said the last part the way he said things that cost him, directly, without softening it, because softening things wasn't what he did. Because you should know that the choice is still yours. What you've done here, what you did the other night, that doesn't make you owe me anything. It goes the other way. May looked at him across the table. The fire was going behind her, and the light was full morning now, and the mountain outside was doing its usual thing, white and vast and entirely unconcerned with human arrangements. She thought about the diner table and the 48 cents and the conditions she'd laid out, and she thought about 9 days of managing a cabin alone and a man through a fever, and she thought about 3 in the morning and things he'd said that he'd insisted counted. What do you want? She asked. Not what you're offering. What do you want? He was quiet for a moment that she let sit without filling it. I want you to stay, he said. Not for the deed or the assessor. It stopped being about that a while ago. He looked at her steadily. I want you to stay because this house is different with you in it, and I'm different with you in it, and I don't think I knew how... He paused. How much I'd stopped expecting that. Someone to rebuild the fire and argue with me about ladders and read poetry I didn't know I needed to hear. Something in May's chest, which had been holding itself in a careful position for a while, shifted. I'm not a simple person, she said. You know that. I know that. I have a specific way I think things should be done, and I'm not always right about it, but I'm always thorough about it. I know that too. And I'm still finding out who I am on the other side of the last 2 years. I'm not finished with that. I'm not asking you to be finished, he said. I'm not finished either. She looked at him. He was exactly what he'd been from the beginning, impractical in none of the ways Daniel had been impractical, and difficult in completely different ways. A man whose silences were real, and whose words, when they came, carried everything they were supposed to carry. A man who'd packed the axe blade in the medicine box. Who'd moved the chinking bucket closer to her hand without saying anything. Who'd talked about timber so she'd have something to stitch against. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right, you'll stay, or all right, you've heard me. All right, I'll stay. She picked up the coffee mug. But I want it on record that you make decisions about dangerous logging equipment in weather conditions that are objectively unreasonable, and I intend to argue with you about that on a regular basis. The expression that settled onto his face then was the fullest version she'd seen of it. Not the brief surprised laugh, not the deliberate smile over supper, but something that involved his whole face in the particular way of something genuine that had waited a long time to be given room. I expect you will, he said. She drank her coffee. He drank his. The fire crackled behind her and the mountain sat outside the window doing what it always did, and the cabin held its warmth around them the way it had learned to do. And May Ashcroft, sat across the table from the man who'd walked through a blizzard to find her holding a porch post in the dark, and felt the particular, unmistakable weight of something that had stopped being uncertain and become, instead, solid, not perfect, not resolved into something clean and without remainder. She still had things to find out about herself, and so did he, and the mountain was still the mountain, beautiful and brutal and entirely honest about what it cost to live at the edge of it. But solid was enough. Solid was more than she'd had in a long time, and she knew what to do with it. She knew how to build things that held. Winter did not leave the mountain graciously. It left the way it had arrived, on its own terms, without asking anyone's permission, in its own time and by its own logic. February gave way to March with no visible change in the temperature or the snow depth or the gray permanence of the sky, and May had been on the mountain long enough by then that she'd stopped expecting the calendar to mean anything in particular. The mountain ran on different time. She'd learned to run on it too. Gideon healed slowly and badly, and with the specific frustration of a man whose body had always been a reliable instrument and was now running behind schedule. The stitches held through the worst of it. The wound closed from the edges inward over 3 weeks, leaving a scar that would be significant and permanent, and that she had watched form with a feeling she couldn't fully name, something between relief and the acknowledgement of how close the other outcome had been. He was back on restricted work by the end of the second week, which in his definition of restricted meant he wasn't in the timber but was doing everything else. And in May's definition of restricted meant she argued with him about it every other day with decreasing effect. "The Henderson tree," he said one morning in early March, standing at the window with his coffee, looking toward the north stand. "What about it?" "It's still leaning. If there's a freeze-thaw cycle on that slope before I can get the ropes on it, it'll take the equipment shed when it comes down." "You said 3 more weeks before the wound is stable enough for timber work." "I said approximately 3 weeks. Approximately 3 weeks is not now." He turned from the window. "It might fall tonight. It might not fall until April. Gideon." She set down the pan she was holding and faced him across the kitchen. She'd gotten better at this, at standing in the argument rather than managing it from the side. "Describe to me exactly what happens if the Henderson tree falls on the equipment shed." A pause. "We lose the shed. Some equipment. Can it be replaced?" "Not cheaply, but it can be replaced." She picked the pan back up. "Can you be replaced if you tear those stitches open in the timber alone and can't get back to the cabin?" He was quiet. "No," she said. "So the tree can wait 3 more weeks, and the shed will either be there or it won't. And either way, you'll be functional enough to address it." She went back to the stove. "That's the decision." Another pause. Longer. "You're not wrong," he said finally, with the tone of a man who'd arrived at a conclusion he'd been avoiding. "I know." She heard him move away from the window and sit at the table, and she heard the particular silence of a man accepting something he couldn't argue with, and she let herself feel what that was. Not triumph, not exactly, but the quieter satisfaction of 2 people who'd learned how to disagree about things that mattered without one of them having to become smaller in the process. The Henderson tree did not fall that night, or the next week, or the week after that. When Gideon finally went to address it in late March, fully healed and with May's explicit and only partially ironic permission, she watched him go from the porch with the same feeling she'd had on the morning of the big storm. The one she'd learned to identify as a fact about herself rather than a weakness. She cared what happened to him. That was real information, and she'd stopped treating it as a thing requiring concealment. He came back at mid-afternoon with the Henderson tree roped and braced and all his stitches still in order, and he came onto the porch and looked at her. And she looked at him, and neither of them said anything about it, which was its own kind of conversation. It was early April when the man from the lumber company came. May was in the root cellar doing the spring inventory, cataloging what remained of their winter stores, what needed replenishing, what it held and what hadn't. When she heard the horse in the yard and came up to find a man she didn't recognize tying up at the porch rail. He was town-dressed in a way that looked wrong on the mountain, the kind of clothing that communicated an indoor life and an indoor life's assumptions about how other people lived. "Help you?" she said from the porch steps. He looked at her with the mild surprise of a man who'd expected to find a logging claim and found instead a woman looking at him with level, unsentimental eyes. "I'm looking for Gideon Ashcroft." "He's in the timber. Who are you?" He gave her a name she didn't recognize and the name of the lumber company she did recognize, Vanthorpe Timber, which Gideon had mentioned twice, both times with the specific economy of language he used for things he had genuine anger about. They'd been working to acquire his claim for 2 years, pressing on his provisional deed status the way water pressed on a crack in stone. "I'll tell him you came," she said. "I'd prefer to wait." "You're welcome to." She went back inside. She put the kettle on because hospitality on the frontier was its own kind of contract that existed independent of whether you liked the person you were being hospitable toward. And she stood at the window and watched the man from Vanthorpe Timber stand in the yard and look at the cabin and the outbuildings with the appraising expression of someone calculating what a thing was worth. And she felt a cold thread of anger move through her that was clean and clarifying. Gideon came back an hour later, saw the horse, saw the man, and came onto the porch with his face doing the specific thing it did when he was working to keep his expression from doing something else. "Ashcroft," the man said. "Wendell Price. Vanthorpe Timber." "I know who you are," Gideon said. He didn't offer a hand. Price smiled the practiced smile of a man who dealt in negotiations and had learned that smiling was useful regardless of whether it was returned. "I wanted to come up before the thaw made the pass difficult. We've been reviewing the land office status on this claim." "I'm married," Gideon said. Price paused. I'm sorry? The provisional deed requires married occupancy for permanent status. Gideon's voice was flat and informational. I'm married. Have been since December. The documentation was filed with Harmon at the Garner settlement and forwarded to the land office in January. He looked at Price without any particular heat. So whatever you came up here to discuss, it's already resolved. Price looked at May in the doorway behind Gideon. She watched him process the things she knew he was processing. Whether this was real, whether there was an angle here, whether there was a challenge worth pursuing. She looked back at him with the expression she'd developed over a winter on a mountain, which was not aggressive and not performative, but was simply the face of a woman who had been through enough that other people's calculations didn't particularly unsettle her. Well, Price said, and the smile took on a different quality. Congratulations are in order then. Thank you for the ride up, Gideon said. The pass road's better going south in the morning. Price took his leave. They watched him ride out of the yard, and May came to stand beside Gideon on the porch, and they watched until the horse and rider disappeared into the trees on the south trail. January, she said. What? You said the documentation was forwarded to the land office in January. It was. You did that without telling me. He glanced at her. It was a necessary step. I know it was a necessary step. I'm saying you did it without mentioning it. A brief pause. I didn't think you'd object. I don't object, she said. I'm observing that you did it quietly. He was looking at this tree line where Price had disappeared. I didn't want you to feel like that it was a transaction again. The paperwork. May looked at the side of his face. She thought about the diner in December and the terms she'd laid out and the careful contractual structure of what they'd started. And she thought about who she was now versus who she'd been then. And she thought about what it said about a man that he'd filed the paperwork and said nothing about it because he hadn't wanted her to feel reduced by it. All right, she said. All right, you understand, or all right, it's fine. Both, she said. And then because she'd been thinking about it since the previous month and had simply been deciding whether to say it. I wasn't going to leave in spring. He looked at her. I told you I'd decide when the pass opened. I'd already decided in February. I just hadn't said it yet. Why not? She thought about that honestly, the way she tried to think about things. Because I wanted to be sure I was staying because I wanted to stay and not because the winter had made staying feel like the only option. I needed to know the difference. She looked at the yard, the familiar shape of it now, the specific way the light fell on the woodpile in the afternoon. I know the difference. Gideon was quiet for a moment with the quality of quiet. That meant he was receiving something and giving it the weight it was due. Good, he said, and then, I'm glad. Those two words from this man, at this point in this story, they were enough. The assessor came in late April, a small, precise man named Colbert, who arrived with a leather satchel in a manner that suggested he'd seen every variety of frontier arrangement and had developed the ability to process them without editorial comment. He walked through the cabin, asked several practical questions, examined the documentation Gideon provided, and then sat at their table, the heavy handmade table with the iron repair on the leg, and drank the coffee May offered and wrote in his ledger for 20 minutes. He closed the ledger. Permanent deed, he said. Effective spring thaw. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Ashcroft. He rode back down the mountain before noon. Gideon stood in the yard holding the deed copy Colbert had left, and May stood beside him, and the April light was doing something extraordinary on the snow that remained on the upper peaks, a kind of gold that came only in the later light of a day in early spring when the air was still cold enough to be clear, but the sun had remembered what it was for. 4 years, she said. 4 years, he confirmed. He was looking at the paper and she was watching him look at it, and she saw something in his face that she thought was about his father, about a man who'd saved toward this and not made it. She didn't say that. Some things didn't need to be named out loud, and she'd learned to tell the difference. Well, she said, it's yours. Ours, he said, not looking up. May took that word and turned it over and found it was the right shape for what it was describing. Ours, she agreed. The spring thaw came the way it always did on this mountain, which was not gently. The snow didn't recede so much as surrender under protest, leaving behind it a landscape that was mud and meltwater and the specific chaos of a place reorganizing itself after months of enforced stillness. The creek behind the eastern tree line, which had been frozen solid since November, came back with a violence that surprised her even though Gideon had told her it would. Roaring for 2 weeks, brown with displaced sediment, loud enough at night that she could hear it from inside the cabin. Everything that had been preserved under snow was revealed, in both the good and bad senses. The porch step she hadn't known had cracked, until the frost heave pushed the pieces apart. The section of fence around the small kitchen garden she'd built in February from found materials, which had held through everything and stood intact in the new mud. Small victories, small losses, the mountain keeping its own accounts. It was in this season of reorganization that Berta Harmon came to visit. She arrived on a morning in early May with Harmon's second horse and a basket and the demeanor of a woman who'd been waiting a reasonable length of time to satisfy a reasonable curiosity. May liked her immediately in the practical way she liked people who were what they appeared to be without apology. "I've been wanting to come since December," Berta said, sitting at the table with her coffee, looking at the cabin with eyes that were taking a comprehensive inventory without being rude about it. She was 60 and had the hands of someone who'd worked hard most of her life and the eyes of someone who'd found it mostly worth it. Harmon said, "Give them the winter." "Smart man," May said. "Sometimes." Berta looked at her. "You're not what I pictured." "What did you picture?" "I'm not sure. Someone more, I don't know, less settled." She cocked her head slightly. "You look like you've been here longer than 5 months." May thought about that. "I feel like I have," she said, and realized as she said it that it was true, and that it was not a complaint. The mountain had a way of making time real that town life didn't, each day distinct, marked by specific weather and specific work and specific small decisions that had actual consequences. She'd lived more calendar time in 5 months up here than in the previous year in Frost Hollow, and she'd come out of it knowing things about herself that she wouldn't have learned any other way. "How is he?" Berta asked, not quite casual. "Better," May said. "The wound healed clean." "I meant—" Berta paused, choosing the words with some care. "He's been up here a long time alone. That does things to a person. Not always bad things, but things." May looked at her. "He's all right," she said. "He's—" She stopped, trying to find words that were accurate rather than either romanticized or minimized. "He's a man who needed someone to hold the other end of things. He didn't know that was what he needed, but he does better with someone holding the other end." Berta looked at her for a moment and then smiled, the real kind, that used her whole face. "Yes," she said. "I imagine he does." Gideon came in from the timber at mid-afternoon and found Berta at his table and absorbed this information without visible alarm, which May counted as evidence of his improvement since December. He sat with them and drank coffee and answered Berta's questions with his usual economy of language. And May watched the three of them in the late afternoon light of the cabin and thought about what this was, what it meant to be part of a small human web out here at the edge of everything. Harmon and Berta, 3 miles east, the Garner families a mile beyond that, winter between them for months at a time, and the trail connecting them in the seasons when the trail was passable. Community built different on a frontier. It was less dense, more deliberate, and maybe because of that, more real. You didn't live near these people by accident or convenience. You chose each other across the distance, and that choice was repeated every time you made the ride. After Berta left, in the long light of the May evening, May sat on the porch with her book and didn't read it. She sat and looked at the yard and the tree line and the mountain above, and she thought about the shape of the life she was in. She thought about the woman who'd stood in a street in December holding a post in the dark and waited for her legs to work again. She thought about what that woman had understood about herself in that moment. Not her strength, she hadn't known about her strength yet, but her refusal. The small, unreasonable, entirely human refusal to be done yet. It had been the only thing she'd had, and it had been enough to carry her to a diner table and a conversation that had rearranged everything. She thought about Daniel, who would have had many opinions about all of this. Complicated, enthusiastic, not always useful opinions, delivered with total conviction and genuine love. She thought about his laugh, which had been nothing like Gideon's, louder and easier, and she held both of these things, the memory of one man and the reality of another, and found that they fit in the same space without diminishing each other. The heart turned out to be more capacious than she'd given it credit for. It could hold grief and gratitude simultaneously without either one canceling the other out. Gideon came out and sat in the other porch chair. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She considered lying or simplifying and decided against both. "About how I got here," she said. "All of it. The whole chain of it." He looked at the yard. The mud had mostly dried in the recent days, and the ground was showing the first tentative green at its edges, the mountain's reluctant concession that another season had, in fact, arrived. And I keep thinking about the part where I was holding on to that post in the street," she said, "and I think, what if I'd let go? What if I'd sat down and just—" She stopped. "You didn't, though," he said. "No, but it wasn't strength. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't strength yet. It was just stubbornness, just the unreasonable refusal to fall down when falling down was the easier thing." He was quiet for a moment. "Maybe that's what strength is," he said. "Before you know you have it." May looked at him. He was watching the tree line with his hands on the arms of the chair, and the evening light was doing what evening light did to his face. And she thought, with the plain, unmystified clarity that she'd come to trust more than any other internal voice, that she was fortunate. Not in the uncomplicated way of someone who'd never had anything taken from them. In the harder, more specific way of someone who had, and who had stayed upright anyway, and who had found, on the other side of it, something that was worth every cost of getting there. "That's what it is," she said. "That's exactly what it is." Spring deepened into the kind of May that the mountain apparently kept in reserve for years, when it had been particularly brutal in winter. Warmer than usual, clear-skied, the snowpack pulling back from the lower elevations and leaving behind a green so new it almost hurt to look at. The timber in the north stand was producing well. The kitchen garden, her garden, was coming up in the organized rows she'd laid out in frozen ground 2 months ago on a theory that this was where the light would hit best, and the theory had been right. Small things. The whole life was made of small things, chosen and maintained and rebuilt when they failed, and that was not a diminishment of it. That was the definition of it. The lumber company did not come back. Word reached them through Harmon, who had it from a rider out of the Southern Valley, that Van Thorpe Timber had shifted its acquisition efforts to a different section of the range, a claim without a permanent deed, a simpler target. May heard this and felt nothing particular about it, which told her she'd never been as afraid of that outcome as she might have been. Some part of her had always understood that what they'd built up here was not a thing that could be easily taken. Not by a company with legal leverage, not by a winter that had tried its best, not by a saw wound in a blizzard, not by the long accumulated weight of isolation and uncertainty, and two people who didn't know each other learning how to hold the other end of things. It was June when the first timber sale went through. A mill in the valley had been waiting on Gideon's spring cut, and when the lumber came down the mountain on the first of the passable days, May went with him, the first time she'd been off the mountain since December, riding the roan mare down the trail that she'd come up in the dark 6 months ago and barely seen. The valley below was the different world. Warmer, louder, full of the crowded human noise of a settlement that had real streets and real commerce and real walls between people. She looked at it from the trail and found that she'd been changed enough by the mountain that it all seemed slightly too much of everything. Too loud, too flat, too contained. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected to feel relief or longing at the sight of civilization. What she felt instead was a mild, interested detachment, the feeling of a visitor observing a place they understand but don't belong to. The mill transaction took most of the morning. May stood outside the mill office in the early summer sun and listened to the valley, and thought that she'd be glad to go home, and noted with something between amusement and genuine surprise that home was no longer a word that required any thought about what it referred to. On the ride back up, at the point where the trail entered the tree line and the mountain reclaimed them from the valley's sight, Gideon said, "Good price." "How good?" He told her. She did the arithmetic. "We can replace the shed roof," she said, "before next winter. The east corner's been worrying me." "I know. And the spring inlet needs a proper housing, something that won't freeze at the connection point." "I was thinking the same thing. And, May." He was looking at the trail ahead with what she'd come to recognize as his version of amusement. "We can make a list." "I have a list," she said. "I've had a list since February." He laughed. "The real one, the full one, The one that had taken her a month to hear for the first time, and that she'd never gotten completely used to because it was the most honest thing about him, the thing that came out when all the management fell away. "Show me tonight," he said. "We'll go through it." They rode up through the trees, through the cool green shadow of the old-growth pines with the light coming through in pieces. And May looked at the mountain above them and the trail ahead and felt the weight of a day that had been good in the ordinary, undramatic way that the best days were good. Work done, a fair return for it, the road home familiar and real beneath the horse's feet. She thought not for the first time. This is not the life she planned. She'd planned once, in the optimistic years with Daniel, in the smaller, more desperate planning of Frost Hollow, for something more legible. A house in a town. No neighbors. A life with softer edges than this one had. She didn't miss that plan. She was aware of not missing it. That was worth something, to know the difference between a life you've settled for and a life you've actually chosen, between what you wanted before you knew what you needed and what you have now that you've learned the difference. The mountain was still the mountain. It would still try to kill them in its patient, impersonal way, through cold and ice and the specific accidents of an outdoor life at the edge of what humans were built for. It had already tried, more than once, and it would try again. That was not a problem to be solved. That was the context of the life, the permanent condition, the thing you learned to live beside rather than against. What you built in that context, you built to last. You built it with the understanding that it would be tested, and so you didn't cut corners, and you didn't pretend things were solid that weren't, and you didn't let the roof go another season without addressing the east corner just because addressing it was inconvenient. You did the work while you could do it, because you had learned what it cost when you didn't. May had learned that. She'd learned it the way the mountain taught everything, directly, without softening it, at the exact moment when the lesson was unavoidable. She would take it forward with her. The cabin came into view through the trees in the late afternoon, the same way it always did. Gradually, detail by detail, first the smell of old wood smoke that the walls had absorbed into themselves over years. Then the stone chimneys against the sky. Then the windows reflecting the western light. Then the porch rail she'd replaced in November, and the north wall she'd rechinked in February, and the small kitchen garden now green and organized in its rows in the southern yard. The sum of 6 months of daily work, visible and solid, and hers, theirs. She pulled the roan up in the yard and dismounted and stood in the evening light and looked at it, the way she'd looked at it the very first night. Except now she knew what was inside every door and every shelf and every silence between the walls. And she knew the weight of the quilt on the bed in the small back room, and she knew the specific sound of the fire in high wind versus the fire in still weather, and she knew how the mountain looked at dawn in every kind of light it produced. She knew this place. It knew her back, in the way that places came to know the people who worked them, and cared for them, and stayed. Gideon unsaddled the gray and came to stand beside her in the yard. They stood for a moment looking at the cabin together, without saying anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. Then she went inside and put the kettle on and pulled out the list she'd been keeping since February. 2 pages of close handwriting, maintenance, improvements, the practical forward planning of people who intended to be somewhere for a long time, and smoothed it on the table. He sat across from her and looked at it, and reached for his pencil. They started from the top,